Okay. As James said, I'm Clyde, and I would like to thank you, James, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's a discussion that I've had with many people in the past, including the late Member of Parliament for Brent. Many of you may or may not have heard of him, a chap, a very fiery chap called Bernie Grant. And he is the only person that I know of that has actually raised this in Parliament. And him and I also had many heated debates around the subject. To give you a bit of background, I was born in Barbados, a tiny island in the Caribbean. And I was actually born on the or in the tenements of the now, I guess, more famous estate, sugar estate called Drax Hall, which is in St. George, in the parish of St. George, in the center of Barbados. And why is it now attracting attention? First of all, this estate was where sugar was introduced into Barbados. They started to grow the sugarcane, and it was owned by the Drax family from Dorset. And just recently, an organization known as Stand Up to Racism Dorset asked the Tory MP Richard Drax, who represents South Dorset, to relinquish his ownership of the estate, returning it to Barbadians as an act of reparation. That was not a Caribbean organization. That's an organization right on his doorstep. So that's a bit of background knowledge. I went to the local boys' school, went to the high school or one of the high schools in the city, and I came to the UK when I was 15 years old. Um, I think also that what would be relevant is that the local estate, Draxall, is still making substantial funds for the Drax family who live in their stately home in Dorset. So that sets the scene. While I would say his workers on the plantation probably earning less than £5 an hour. So there you go. Um, Over the last 40 years, I've been involved in the flat glass industry. And at one point, I employed over 140 people in my own factory. So I've had a lot of experience in business, in social enterprise, through my work in setting up various organizations to help to empower our people in the communities around Birmingham. So, does Britain owe reparation? Well, I am not going to argue with those who would argue against it. I would just argue for it. And why? Certainly in the case of the Caribbean, Blacks have been way too badly treated. I would say that, well, most people I hope would agree that slavery is a brutal and profound dehumanization of Black people in the Caribbean, the Americas, and subsequently the world, because it created a hierarchy where whites were at the top and Blacks at the bottom. all the others, brown, Chinese, whatever, in the middle. So the blacks were at the bottom, and this structure continued from slavery. This structure was created in slavery and it continues today. So the blacks are at the bottom and they're being looked down upon by all the others. This structure was what can only be described as white supremacy. As a result, this brutal legacy now permeates the life of all Black people across the world. People of color in between, particularly the Blacks, continue to suffer endemic discrimination in all walks of life. Employment, housing, education, health, income, wealth, home ownership, to name but a few. This has led to institutional racism as well. Reparation can take various forms. And I guess some may say cash is best. But even that starts another debate of who do you pay the cash to? This then takes us down another narrative and away from the main point of achieving recognition and compensation for what has been done by slavery. Reparation was paid to the slave owners. So how can we deny reparation to Blacks? And in recent times here in Britain, we were informed by HMRC actually that we all contributed to paying reparation to the slave owners. So Britain has already set a precedent for reparation by the payment of the slave owners. This was a sum so large that the government had to borrow money from the treasury and raise a tax levy to repay. HMRC recently informed us that we all contributed to the freedom of the slaves in 1834 when the last loan payment was made in 2015. In today's value, it would be in excess of 100 billion. The descendants of slaves living in this country had to help in paying off the slave owners. So this established a principle of reparation. It was the slaves who had suffered the indignity of being stolen from their own homes in Africa, shipped across the Atlantic in the most inhumane conditions, resulting in being sold into slavery and given free hard labor to the slave owners for over 300 years. Many of Britain's establishments, such as churches, banking, insurance, and great cities, benefited by having association with slave owners or involved in the slave trade direct. And the likes of Richard Drax, as mentioned previously. I think both the Drax family and David Cameron's family, who were active in the Caribbean. I think David Cameron's family were in Jamaica primarily, and Richard Drax's family were in Barbados. And they're still benefiting from the proceeds of slavery. In addition, the slaves were fed a diet of cheap food made up of salt meat, mainly pork and beef, and also salt fish, and of course, high carbohydrate foods that gave energy so that they can do the work on the plantations. We, the descendants of slaves, are left a legacy of ill health in the form of high blood pressure and diabetes as a result of that diet. We now suffer from these illnesses at a much higher percentage than whites and blacks who are not from the Caribbean diaspora. It is now claimed that over 60% of the black people in the Caribbean who are over the age of 60 suffer from one or both of these illnesses. Hypertension and diabetes are actually considered to be at an epidemic rate in the Caribbean, the Americas, and in Britain, in the descendants of slaves communities. So slavery is still killing descendants of slaves. What did the former colonial islands end up with? Poverty. That's all, poverty. The people in the end had to flee the islands in search of a better life in Britain and the Americas, and anywhere an industrial environment existed that can provide a sustainable economy, processing the same base products from the Caribbean. Blacks sit at the bottom of the economic structure because they had to give away over 300 years of unpaid labor. Blacks didn't get compensation. They got sentenced to hard labor because even after slavery was abolished, they still had to give half of their working week for nothing. The whites sit at the top because they got labor for over 300 years and reparation as well, or the slave owners got the reparation. And that wealth remains with us today in our societies. The islands got nothing but failing crops when the annual season of hurricanes sweep through the islands. Hunger and starvation, as most of their foods have to be imported. Sustain ill health in the form of high blood pressure and diabetes. An underdeveloped country with poor infrastructure, lacking advanced health care, and a community that depends almost solely on the government for employment. These should be enough to justify reparation. Britain needs to return to the islands and help to fix these issues themselves by directly funding the answers to the ills they are left behind. Set up decent hospitals and sustain them. Build roads. Treat the sick who are suffering from hypertension and diabetes and other illnesses directly related to the slavery legacy. They should also help to set up sustainable industries, build decent housing, because there are still areas in all the islands where housing is totally well below par. It should also help to move the people out of subsistence living into humane living. Give people hope so that the people want to stay in their islands, work in their islands because they're jobs, and enjoy the tourist view of idyllic in their own islands. This situation was created by Britain, and Britain owes the islands and the people of the islands justice. That is why I believe reparation is a necessity by